There are moments in life when you think you truly understand someone, right up until one quiet instant proves you never really did. You assume their silence means indifference. You assume their distance means they've mentally checked out. You assume their calm expression means they're not feeling anything at all. But sometimes the quietest person in the room is actually fighting the loudest battle inside their own head. Avoidant people often withdraw not because they don't care, but because emotional closeness can activate deep-seated fears and protective patterns. Their distance is frequently a response to feeling overwhelmed rather than a lack of emotion. Understanding this can make their behavior easier to interpret, while still recognizing that lasting change depends on their willingness to address those patterns. An avoidant person's emotional armor doesn't develop in adulthood. It starts forming years earlier, usually in childhood, and often without any single dramatic event triggering it. Sometimes the home was physically safe, but emotionally unpredictable. Sometimes the adults around them were present in body, but distant in spirit. Sometimes they absorbed subtle messages like "stay strong," "stop crying," "don't be so emotional," or "just handle things on your own." A child takes in those messages quietly, without ever consciously deciding to. They learn that expressing feelings doesn't actually bring people closer. Instead, it brings discomfort, conflict, or disapproval. So they start shrinking the emotional space they allow themselves. They learn vulnerability is risky rather than rewarding. They learn self-reliance isn't just good, it's essential for survival. As they get older, these early lessons calcify into automatic survival responses. By adulthood, they cling to independence the way someone else might cling to security or reassurance. It becomes their shield, their comfort zone, their safe territory. They learn to manage everything internally because depending on other people never felt reliable or safe. Even though they might secretly crave deep connection, the moment someone gets too close too fast, those old emotional alarms start blaring. What looks to you like them backing away is actually them trying to regulate internal overwhelm. What you interpret as indifference is often genuine fear of losing themselves under the weight of someone else's emotions. This is the piece almost everyone gets wrong. Avoidant people aren't running away from you specifically. They're running from emotions they never learned how to hold safely in the first place. They're avoiding the version of themselves that once felt pressured, unseen, or burdened with more responsibility than they could handle. They fear repeating old patterns where closeness got tangled up with discomfort or unspoken expectation. They fear becoming trapped inside someone else's emotional world without enough room to breathe freely. Their avoidance isn't really aimed at you as a person. It's a protective strategy that existed long before you ever came into the picture. Psychology actually has a name for this. Avoidant individuals rely on something called deactivating strategies, automatic, largely unconscious habits that reduce emotional closeness the instant it starts feeling too intense. This might show up as suddenly needing space right after a deep, meaningful conversation. It might look like switching to pure logic the second emotions start rising. It might sound like an internal narrative saying I should back off, or they don't really need me, or maybe they're better off without me entirely. None of these are deliberate attempts to sabotage the connection. They're attempts to protect their own emotional equilibrium. It's simply their nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do long before adulthood ever arrived. And yet here's the paradox that complicates everything. Avoidant people secretly want closeness just as much as anyone else does. They just want it from a distance that doesn't overwhelm their system. They want to be loved without feeling consumed. They want support without feeling smothered by it. They want real connection, just not the kind that demands surrendering their entire sense of self. If you watch closely, you'll notice them constantly walking a tightrope between craving closeness and fearing it, leaning in one moment, pulling back the next, opening up briefly before shutting down again. It's not that they're inconsistent people, it's that they're deeply conflicted internally. Their strongest needs are constantly colliding with their strongest fears. So why does understanding any of this actually matter? Because once you see the emotional blueprint driving their behavior, everything shifts. You stop reacting emotionally to their reactions. You stop feeling personally rejected by their silence. You stop mirroring their distance with distance of your own. Instead, you start responding in a way that actually fits their nervous system rather than triggering it further. You stop relying on emotional intensity, pressure, demands, and heavy expectations as your tools for building connection. Because for avoidant people, those tools don't build closeness at all. They set off alarms. And when those alarms go off, they retreat even further, not because they want to hurt you or the relationship, but because their emotional survival instincts insist that they must. What actually reaches someone avoidant looks completely different: calmness, clarity, emotional spaciousness, words that invite rather than demand, words that reassure without crowding them. Words that show strength without applying pressure. When they sense that you're steady rather than reactive, something inside them genuinely begins to soften. When they notice that your presence doesn't arrive carrying emotional weight, guilt, or urgency, their nervous system relaxes. And in that relaxed state, they can actually hear you clearly. They can actually trust you. They can actually start opening up in small but meaningful ways. Avoidant people absolutely can open up beautifully, deeply, and consistently, just not when they feel rushed, pushed, cornered, or expected to bond according to someone else's timeline. They open when they feel genuinely respected, when they feel safe, when they feel like their boundaries are being honored rather than interpreted as rejection. When they finally feel like they have room to breathe, to think, to process their emotions at their own pace. That's exactly when their inner alarms finally quiet down. That's when their emotional armor starts loosening. That's when real connection begins growing, slowly, subtly, but genuinely. So before you try to craft the perfect sentence or wait for the perfect moment to reach an avoidant person, understand the actual foundation of what you're trying to build in the first place. Their avoidance isn't the enemy here. It's an old solution, a survival pattern that once kept them emotionally protected long before they ever met you. And once you genuinely recognize that, once you see the actual human being underneath all that distance, you become capable of speaking to them in a way that feels safe rather than overwhelming. You can reach the part of them that's been shut down for years, not through force, but through steady presence, not through pressure, but through patience. Here's a truth worth never forgetting. You cannot reach an avoidant person on any deep level until you understand exactly what they've been protecting all along. They aren't protecting themselves from you specifically. They're protecting themselves from the fear of losing their own identity. The moment they realize you're not trying to take anything away from them, but are genuinely trying to understand them instead, that's the exact moment connection becomes possible. That's when their heart genuinely starts to open, not out of fear, but out of trust. If you really want to understand how to reach someone avoidant, you have to understand the emotional currency they actually operate on. It isn't affection in the traditional sense, it isn't high intensity, and it's definitely not emotional speeches or dramatic attempts to force closeness into existence. Avoidant people respond to emotional safety, the kind that doesn't overwhelm them, doesn't invade their inner space, and doesn't demand rapid closeness before they're ready for it. Most people get this completely backwards. They assume connection grows through more emotional expression, more vulnerability, more reassurance, more conversation about feelings. But with avoidant individuals, the harder you push, the further back they move. Not because they don't care about you, but because their nervous system interprets emotional pressure as danger, even when your underlying intention is pure love. For someone avoidant, emotional safety rests on one central idea. They need to know they can remain themselves in your presence. Sit with that for a second because it matters. Their biggest fear isn't intimacy itself. Their real fear is losing themselves inside intimacy, the fear that getting close means sacrificing pieces of their identity, their freedom, their independence, their inner peace, their emotional boundaries, their sense of control over their own life. The moment they feel emotional pressure building, their mind activates old survival patterns. They pull away, they create distance, or they shut down entirely. It's not that they want distance from you specifically. They need distance from emotional expectations weighing on them. This is exactly where a lot of people unintentionally damage the connection they're trying to build. They react to the avoidant person's withdrawal with more pursuit, more questions, more attempts to fix things immediately. But what feels like healthy communication to you often feels like tightening tension to them, and the whole cycle intensifies. You push, they step back further. You ask for more, they give even less. It's not that they lack feelings, they actually feel things very deeply. The real difference is that they don't have the internal capacity to process emotional intensity in the same immediate way you might. This is exactly why your choice of language matters far more than you probably realize. Avoidant people don't hear words the same way someone with secure or anxious attachment does. They're constantly scanning for safety cues underneath the surface. They're listening for signals confirming they won't be trapped, overwhelmed, or expected to perform emotionally on command. So the most meaningful words you can offer an avoidant person are ones that reduce pressure, strengthen their sense of autonomy, and let them participate at whatever pace they can genuinely handle. It's not distance from connection they actually need. It's distance from emotional urgency. This isn't about walking on eggshells around them constantly. It's about genuinely understanding how their nervous system interprets emotionally charged moments. You're not speaking to their defenses directly. You're speaking through them, past them, to the person underneath. That requires clarity, calmness, steady energy, and a tone that doesn't escalate, doesn't chase, and doesn't try forcing closeness prematurely. When you approach them with real emotional spaciousness, something genuinely powerful happens. The avoidant person stops bracing for impact. They stop anticipating emotional waves crashing over them. They stop assuming disappointment is inevitable or that they'll be swallowed whole by the moment. Their body physically relaxes, and once they relax, they finally start showing up authentically. Avoidant people aren't incapable of connecting. They're only incapable of connecting when they feel pushed or pressured into it. Remove that pressure entirely, and you unlock the part of them that genuinely wants connection all along. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's remarkably effective in practice. The less you push, the more they naturally move toward you. The less you demand, the more they voluntarily give. The less you chase, the more they choose you entirely on their own terms. Because emotional safety, not intensity, not persuasion, not emotionally charged arguments, is the actual key that unlocks them. And emotional safety isn't passive silence on your part either. It's not pretending you have no needs of your own. It's expressing your genuine needs in a calm, stable way. It's saying what you feel without demanding immediate emotional feedback in return. It's giving them space to think without assuming their quietness automatically means rejection. It's maintaining your own emotional balance so they don't feel responsible for managing your reactions on top of their own. When you do this consistently over time, you become something remarkably rare for an avoidant person, a genuinely peaceful place, a space where they don't have to hide who they are, a place where emotions aren't landmines waiting to detonate unexpectedly, a place where they aren't punished for needing more time or moving at a slower pace than everyone else seems to expect. This is exactly when real transformation begins happening. Avoidant people don't open up through emotional force. They open up through emotional stability. They don't open through pressure. They open through steady presence. They don't open because you ask them to. They open because they finally feel safe enough to want to. And that safety isn't built through dramatic declarations or grand romantic gestures. It's built through small, consistent signals. Signals that communicate, I'm here, but I won't overwhelm you. Signals showing you're free to be yourself around me. signals proving that connection with me won't cost you your freedom. When you speak with that kind of calm clarity, your words stop registering as noise their nervous system needs to block out. Instead, your words become genuine signals of safety, signals that allow the avoidant part of them to soften, breathe, and gradually move toward you. That shift is exactly what you're actually hoping for, because deep connection is never created through pressure. It's created through emotional safety, and emotional safety happens to be the one language avoidant people hear louder than absolutely anything else. Build that safety, and they'll meet you in ways that pressure could never accomplish. Now, when we talk about a small handful of words that impact avoidant people more deeply than a straightforward "I love you," we're not talking about anything magical. We're talking about actual psychology, about emotional patterns, nervous system responses, and the hidden fears quietly shaping their behavior. For an avoidant person, hearing "I love you" can occasionally create pressure rather than comfort. It can feel like an expectation forming, like the beginning of emotional demands they're not sure they can meet. For someone who spent most of their life associating love with a loss of autonomy, even the beauty behind those words can trigger fear instead of warmth. So the real question becomes, what kind of words bypass their emotional defenses entirely? What kind of language slips past years of self-protection and fear of being consumed by someone else's needs? Surprisingly, the words that touch an avoidant person most deeply aren't poetic or dramatic at all. They're simple, grounding, and full of emotional freedom. They don't push. They don't pull, they don't create urgency. They open a door gently rather than dragging someone through it. Those particular words are, "I get it." At first glance, this phrase seems far too quiet and small to matter much. But underneath, it delivers something considerably more powerful than emotional affection ever could. It delivers understanding. And for an avoidant person, understanding functions as genuine intimacy. When you say "I get it" to them, what it actually communicates is that they're not wrong for being who they are. They're not broken. They don't need to change themselves fundamentally just to stay connected with you. It tells them that their need for space isn't a threat to the relationship. It gives them real psychological room to breathe freely. And for someone avoidant, autonomy, even more than love or reassurance, is genuinely what keeps them present and engaged. When you say "I get it," you're essentially telling them you see their inner world clearly without trying to control or reshape it. You're acknowledging their fear without accidentally feeding it further. You're demonstrating that you understand their particular pace and rhythm, that closeness for them isn't built through emotional intensity, but through quiet, patient trust. And trust, for avoidant people, gets built through repeated moments where they don't feel judged or rushed to move faster than they're genuinely capable of moving. This matters immensely because avoidant people have an extremely sensitive internal radar for detecting emotional pressure. The instant they sense they're disappointing you or falling short somehow, their instinct is immediate retreat. But when you respond with "I get it" instead, you effectively neutralize that instinct. You're not feeding their underlying fear of being overwhelmed. You're giving them room to be authentically themselves while still remaining connected to you. You're showing them that connection with you doesn't arrive bundled with punishment or emotional storms. These particular words also soften a hidden shame that avoidant people carry but rarely discuss openly. They know they pull back, that opening up takes them longer than it seems to take other people, that their silence can come across as confusing or hurtful. Plenty of them quietly believe they're simply too complicated to be loved properly. But when someone says "I get it" in a calm, steady tone, it tells them they aren't too difficult, that you're not leaving, that they don't have to pretend to be someone else. It proves somebody finally understands the reason behind their patterns, not just the surface behavior, but the root cause underneath it. Avoidant people don't need someone who agrees with absolutely everything they do. They don't need someone who tiptoes around their boundaries as though they're made of fragile glass. What they genuinely need is someone who understands the reasoning behind their patterns, someone who doesn't misread their need for space as a lack of caring, someone who recognizes their distance as emotional protection rather than outright rejection. When they feel that particular kind of understanding, something inside them genuinely settles down, someone who sees the deeper human truth hiding beneath their protective pattern. When you say "I get it," it communicates that you're not fighting against how they're wired internally. You're moving alongside it instead of against it. But let's be completely honest here. These words were never meant to function as some clever manipulation tactic. You don't say "I get it" purely to extract a different reaction out of someone. You say it to genuinely build emotional safety, not as a strategic move, but as an authentic, gentle recognition of their inner world. Because when an avoidant person feels truly understood, they naturally begin opening up on their own. They naturally start easing up their guard. They naturally begin participating more in the relationship, not because you push them into it, but because it finally feels safe enough for them to choose it freely. And that's really the deeper beauty underlying all of this. Autonomy functions as the actual doorway avoidant people use to walk into closeness willingly. When they feel free, they connect. When they feel pushed, they retreat. That's precisely why these few words carry so much weight. They protect the exact thing avoidant people need most, the feeling that they remain in control of their own inner space. Think about it this way. Every avoidant person has constructed emotional walls over time, but those walls were never built to keep everyone permanently locked out. They were built to keep their own mind and heart stable and protected. The moment they recognize that someone genuinely understands that underlying truth, those walls stop functioning like weapons. They slowly transform into bridges instead, a safe pathway that eventually allows the avoidant person to step outside their walls without feeling exposed or vulnerable in a threatening way. So yes, "I love you" carries real power. But for an avoidant person, "I get it" feels genuinely grounding. It calms their nervous system. It softens their underlying fear. It reaches the part of them that's carried the full weight of their own emotional balance for their entire life without help. It tells them they're not alone in navigating this. It tells them they don't have to abandon themselves just to remain close to you. If there's one single thing worth taking away from all of this, it's that understanding functions as the love language avoidant people hear most clearly. When you use those few gentle, steady, pressure-free words, you're not simply soothing their nervous system for a passing moment. You're creating a genuine shift in the entire dynamic between you. Because once an avoidant person feels understood, something powerful genuinely starts happening internally. The inner conflict between wanting closeness while simultaneously fearing it begins settling down. It doesn't vanish instantly, but it softens considerably. And within that softness, they start behaving differently. They begin showing up in ways they simply couldn't manage before. Not because you demanded anything from them, but because you removed the emotional pressure that made everything feel unsafe in the first place. Consider what happens internally for someone who spent most of their life feeling genuinely misunderstood. Someone who learned early on that emotional needs were burdensome, that vulnerability caused conflict, that space equaled safety. When life repeatedly teaches you that closeness equals overwhelming intensity, you naturally learn to distance yourself from anything that feels too intense to handle. They don't do this because they don't care about connection. They do it because their nervous system genuinely learned that protecting itself meant survival. So when you say "I get it" to an avoidant person, you're not merely offering simple kindness. You're actively interrupting an old survival habit that's operated for years. You're showing them that connection doesn't have to steal their peace of mind, that closeness doesn't have to feel suffocating, that being with someone doesn't require constant emotional performance every single second. You're demonstrating that they can be present, breathe freely, stay genuinely connected, and still remain fully themselves throughout it all. From that moment forward, their behavior gradually starts shifting in ways many people never even notice at first. You'll see them communicating a little more, not perfectly and not constantly, but noticeably more than before. They might start conversations on their own initiative, check in first for once, or share something simple about their day, one small piece at a time. It won't happen loudly, it'll happen quietly, in small increments that carry genuine significance, because opening up no longer feels like a threat to them. They feel steady around you, seen without being judged, connected without sacrificing their personal space. And that's precisely when they start rewriting old internal beliefs they've carried for years. Maybe closeness doesn't actually have to hurt. Maybe connection can genuinely coexist alongside independence. Maybe there's real room for both things simultaneously. This is exactly how avoidant attachment gradually restructures itself over time, not through emotional pushing, but through consistent emotional safety, not through intensity, but through steadiness. Avoidant people don't grow because someone drags them forcefully into emotional depth. They grow because someone gives them the space and freedom to discover that depth entirely on their own timeline. And here's the remarkable part. Once they experience connection without underlying fear, they start associating closeness with genuine calm instead of chaos. They start linking vulnerability with relief rather than danger. They begin trusting themselves within the relationship, not just trusting you specifically. That internal shift changes absolutely everything. Because once an avoidant person finally feels emotionally safe, they become capable of loving in a way that's steady, loyal, and deeply committed. They don't love carelessly or casually. They don't attach without real thought behind it. When they genuinely choose someone, they do it with intention and depth. Once the fear softens, once the pressure fades, once their internal alarms finally quiet down, they begin revealing a depth they've kept hidden away for a very long time. This is exactly why patience matters so much here. This is why emotional space genuinely matters in these dynamics. You're not dealing with someone who simply enjoys having space for its own sake. You're dealing with someone whose entire emotional system was built for survival rather than connection. But survival systems absolutely can change over time. They can adapt, they can grow. They just need the right emotional environment in order to do so successfully. And that environment isn't created through intensity, emotional demands, or persistent pressure. It's created through genuine calmness, steadiness, and real understanding. There's also a meaningful shift that tends to happen within you throughout this entire process. You start realizing that relationships aren't really about forcing someone else into a shape that suits your preferences. They're about welcoming another person into a space where both of you can show up as fully human beings. It isn't about solving them like a puzzle or decoding their every move. It's about showing up in a way that genuinely makes real connection possible. And by doing exactly that, you help draw out a version of them they never previously felt safe enough to reveal. Isn't that ultimately what real connection actually is? Not changing someone into a different person, but creating a space where they naturally show more openness, more trust, and more authenticity over time. This is precisely what happens when you speak to an avoidant person in a way that genuinely respects their need for autonomy. Their defenses relax, their walls gradually turn into doors, their quietness becomes a form of communication instead of simply feeling like distance. They begin choosing closeness, not because they're being forced into it, but because for perhaps the first time, they feel genuinely safe enough to actually want it. So understand this clearly. The moment an avoidant person feels deeply and genuinely understood is the exact moment the relationship shifts from resistance toward real possibility. And this particular shift never happens through pressure or emotional force. It happens through intention, through awareness, through gentle patience, through words that empower rather than overwhelm the people receiving them. Because in the end, real transformation inside an avoidant person doesn't happen when they're convinced of something through argument or persuasion. It happens when they're genuinely understood at a deeper level, and when someone finally feels truly understood, they stop running entirely, not from you, but from the fears that have always lived quietly inside themselves.